What is sonic rhetoric? In sum, it is exactly what it sounds like. What it sounds like. Sound is an oft forgotten element of the world around us. Any consistent sound that doesn't require our attention can quickly become background noise. Sonic rhetoric is exactly what it sounds like, in that it is the study of rhetorics of sound, be it music, movies, advertisements, or speeches. All use sound to persuade and influence thoughts and feelings. Even the natural world has its own rhetoric. What does the lark herald, if not the morning? The loon, the lonesome lake. The owl, the haunted night. Certainly, some of you are already mulling over instances in which you can identify sonic rhetoric at work. The quiet shuffle of paper and living bodies taking a test in a classroom. The rushing whir and occasional honks of nearby traffic. The sudden caterwaul of Mariah Carey in the supermarket, pretending the audio doom of every retail worker until New Year. In Katie Fargo Ahern's paper, Understanding Learning Spaces Sonically, Soundscaping Evaluations of Place, she uses the research of Douglas M. Walls, Scott Chaperet, and Danielle Nicole DeVos to explore the soundscape of classrooms. The original research paper, Hacking Spaces, Places Interface, sought to understand how spatial and color design affect the learning experience of students. But though Ahern found the research enlightening and important, she notes that it ignores a significant design element: sound. This is not a rare occurrence, though sound is so ubiquitous in our day-to-day lives. It's massively underutilized in the academic sphere. In my interview with Professor Jonathan W. Stone, he emphasized that within sonic rhetoric is a sort of equitability that allows for certain individuals on the margins to be represented in a way mainstream rhetorics doesn't allow. This is characterized in a certain epideictic quality of sonic rhetoric that Stone attributes to what musicologist Charles L. Seeger Jr. called folkness, which Stone described as an authentic personness. In more common writing and rhetoric circles, however, it is more often referred to as embodiment. Sound has a unique capacity for embodiment. It works by crashing molecules against each other. The closer the molecules are, the faster sound can travel. This is why, as you may have heard, there is no sound in space. There is a lack of connected molecular structure for sound to travel through. The human body, however, is quite molecularly dense, allowing for an incredibly fine attunement to vibrational shifts, little as we may notice. Many of these minute vibrations go completely unregistered to our conscious minds, requiring no attention to keep us safe. But that doesn't mean they don't affect us. Rebecca Rinsema and Josh N. Edwards are musicologists and educators who collaborated on a paper studying the link between sound and embodiment. They conducted 3 case studies, of which I'm going to focus on the first: the rise of EDM in pop music. For their case study, Rinsema and Edwards focused on a specific song, Clarity by Zedd featuring Foxes. Being musicologists, they of course intimately analyzed the song piece by piece, observing the rhetoric implied by the eighth note pulses, the syncopation of the voice and keyboard, the counter melody coming into play at the 47-second mark. Well, we don't need to analyze quite as deeply to understand how this particular song can create embodiment. The eighth note pulse that the song begins with divides twice, turning into 16ths and then 30-seconds, with an electronic pitch in the background starting to slide upward as we hit those 30-second notes. This increase in speed and pitch together create a sense of tension, as Rinsema and Edwards describe, like a kettle on a stove building pressure before it releases at the 1 minute and 9 second mark, the bass literally dropping the pitch back down to its starting point, the rhythm returning to eighth notes. The kettle on the stove analogy is incredibly apt. As the water molecules in the kettle heat up, they move faster, knocking against each other until the pressure comes to a head, releasing with a scream. We can hear the same process in sound, not merely in some abstract analogical sense, but physically, because sound is also pushing molecules against each other within our very bodies. We get the same rising pressure as the kettle. In his article, Sound, Resonance as Rhetorical, rhetorician Byron Hawk draws our attention to the sheer physicality of sound. Quoting David Novak and Matt Sakakina's paper, Keywords in Sound, he writes that sound is a vibration that is perceived and becomes known through its materiality. He goes on to explain that this materialist model of sound allows humans to feel their bodies vibrate empathetically, embodiment, locate themselves in space via reverberation, spatial orientation, and in an environment, analyze language as or with phonemes, communicate via speech, and capture and distribute sound via technological mediation, produce and circulate music and culture. Hawk explains the acoustic concept of resonance as the capacity of a material structure, like a wall, to vibrate at a certain frequency. This resonance is omnipresent, and combined with the ubiquity of sound as vibration, creates inherent embodiment for all sound. Imagine, if you will, that you're watching an episode of The Twilight Zone. I don't do a very good impersonation of Rod Serling's dulcet tones, but anyone familiar with The Twilight Zone will likely have picked up on the reference immediately, simply because the rhythm in which he often spoke that introductory line connected their memory to my mimicry automatically. I imagine The Twilight Zone isn't the most culturally relevant media to bring up as an example. In fact, I don't trust my own knowledge of current pop culture to provide any specific examples, aged and withered as I am, so let's broaden the scope a bit. If you're watching a movie, we'll choose horror to keep on theme, you may notice the ways in which the soundtrack is adding to the rhetoric. The dissonant chords, such as in the Jaws theme, leave unresolved tension, creating an atmosphere of suspense. A use of unusual instruments is often very common in horror soundtracks, making it difficult for the listener to identify the sound as familiar, and contributing to that growing uncertainty. Of course, this is hardly limited to horror or pop EDM. Almost every single auditory object is employing rhetoric in one way or another, consciously or subconsciously. But when did we start recognizing our ability to shape sonic rhetoric? One of the most influential people to utilize sonic rhetoric with stark intentionality was composer and documentarian Glenn Gould. Rhetorician Jonathan Alexander explored that influence in his essay, Glenn Gould and the Rhetorics of Sound. Gould was a recording artist from the 1950s up to his death in 1982, known for his unusual technique of splicing magnetic tapes to edit recordings. In his radio documentary, Idea of the North, Gould explored what it was like to live in the extreme conditions of the Canadian Arctic by interviewing several inhabitants who had migrated there. As Alexander describes, Gould's interweaving of his interviewees' voices and other ambient sounds, trains rolling north and Arctic winds, for instance, seemed to stress the contradictions of the North as a place of isolation and interconnection. a space in which one encounters both one's aloneness and relative smallness, and also one's deep connectedness to the earth and to others. Gold was also known for his very intentional embodiment in his recordings. Originally a concert pianist, he used his tape splicing technique to make very particular edits to compositions that reimagined their rhetoric, often several times over, redoing his own recordings in several ways to create new works of art out of the same source material. Within these recordings, a listener can often hear him humming along to the music, the creak of his chair, the press of the pedals, or tap of his feet. Given his exacting editing style, it is clear that these are purposefully left in, and indeed, from hearing the player alongside the piano, we get a more intimate sense of embodiment, a distinct rhetorical decision. Listen to this example. Some critics don't care for this blatant embodiment, feeling that too much personality distracted from the beauty of the music. Perhaps a kinder way to say, it could get really annoying. A valid, if subjective, criticism. After all, there is assuredly some sort of sound that grates at you above all else. Squeaking styrofoam, metal on teeth, a crying baby. There are sounds that you might find unpleasant, but don't necessarily notice until you need to focus, or it has disappeared, like traffic, the leaky faucet, the drone of a CPU fan. This is where we start to talk about noise. What is noise exactly? As Stephen R. Hammer puts it in his video essay, Writing Dirt, Teaching Noise, a common definition of noise is some variation on noise as a phenomenon that creates displeasure, or noise simply as an unwanted or undesired sound. In other words, noise may simply be a subjectively negative reaction to sonic stimuli. Hammer gently disagrees with this definition, preferring futurist Luigi Russollo's description as a byproduct of technoculture, one that changes our listening habits and therefore our sensibilities. Noises are artifacts that can teach us much about the world around us. But this description still doesn't quite satisfy Hammer. Instead, he envisions 4 characteristics of what makes noise, noise. First, that noise requires work. By this, he is referring mostly to attention work. In some instances, like particularly loud and sudden noises, a listener must work to avoid or alleviate the pain of a loud sound. In other cases, such as competing noises, a listener must work to focus on what they want to listen to versus unrelated sounds around them, like trying to hear the person next to you over a crowd. The work to attend or ignore sound is essential to the definition of noise. Second, noise is always already. Here he exemplifies the difference, or rather lack of difference, between noise and any other sound. Perhaps you have heard the term signal-to-noise ratio. This would be applicable to my previous example of trying to hear someone over a crowd. The person is the signal, the crowd the noise. But Hammer takes umbrage with the idea that noise is a separate entity from sound. After all, the person you were trying to hear over the crowd is contributing to the noise of the crowd. You are, in fact, the traffic. Third, noise is relational. This is probably the most obvious statement of the 4. Whether or not something is a noise depends on its context. Slightly different from subjectively negative reactions to sonic stimuli, whether something is a noise or not depends on the context in which a subject is hearing it. A parent may consider a baby's cry noise when it is not their own baby, because they generally lack the necessity to act in that context. A record scratch may be a noise when you're trying to listen to your favorite record, but it is a significant musical component as part of a live DJ's remix. 4. Noise is dirty. To explain what he means by this, he quotes Mary Douglas's work, Purity and Danger, where she quotes dirt as matter out of place. This is a very suggestive approach. It implies two conditions: a set of ordered relations and a contravention of that order. Dirt, then, is never unique, isolated event. Where there is dirt, there is system. Dirt is the byproduct of a systematic ordering and classification of matter, insofar as ordering involves rejecting inappropriate elements. Hammer continues, by calling noise dirty, I imply an opportunity to oppose systematic rejection and contravention of order. To put it bluntly, he is saying that noise is the dirt of audio. It is the sweat of the work it requires to make sound. It is the very evidence of sonic rhetoric. So, what happens when we get rid of it? Throughout this presentation, I have been deliberately focusing your attention on the rhetoric of sound itself, which makes a lot of sense when we're discussing sonic rhetoric. However, as there are two sides to every coin, the other side of sound is silence, and silence holds as much capacity for rhetoric as any sound. You may have noticed at one point or another that I've been playing white noise in the background up until now. My hope in using this sleight of ear is to mimic the rhetoric of Bernie Krause, a soundscape composer who works primarily with ecological soundscapes, capturing an orchestra of birds, bugs, and other fauna in a chosen area. Particularly, I wanted to mimic what Michelle Comstock and Mary E. Hawkes highlighted in their essay, The Sounds of Climate Change, Sonic Rhetoric in the Anthropocene, the Age of Human Impact. Of Krause, they state, his recordings of Lincoln Meadow in the Sierra Nevada mountains, before and after logging, demonstrate a radical shift in the biophony. And here they quote him directly. It was obvious that the once sonorous voice of the meadow had vanished. Gone was the thriving density and diversity of birds. Gone, too, was the overall richness that had been present the year before. The intention of this rhetoric is not to be hopelessly grim, but rather to show in a distinctly embodied way in which we are connected to, and therefore affect, our environment. Sound has a unique capacity for embodiment. It works by crashing molecules against each other. The closer the molecules are, the faster sound can travel. The human body is quite molecularly dense, allowing for an incredibly fine attunement to vibrational shifts, little as we may notice. Many of these minute vibrations go completely unregistered to our conscious minds, requiring no attention to keep us safe. But that doesn't mean they don't affect us. Sound works by crashing molecules against each other. It is inherently embodied. It is inherently connected. We are inherently connected to everything that makes sound, whether we can hear it or not. we can feel it. Understanding this is integral to understanding sonic rhetoric and the meaning we make out of it. So, what is sonic rhetoric? It is exactly what it sounds like.